What are niche fragrances, and do we actually need to define it? Let's talk about this and other topics in today's episode of FragTalk. Hello, welcome back to Seldomly Often. I'm Daniel, today we're talking fragrances, and this is episode 3 of FragTalk, a more open-ended, free-form podcast-style format that allows me to cover more fragrance-related topics and to discuss it with you. Today's topic of conversation is all about niche fragrances. Is there really a definition for niche fragrances? How do they differ from designers? And are there subcategories of niche fragrances? These are questions that some of you have been asking me. And to be completely honest, on my side, I don't feel that these answers are necessarily relevant to how you should be experiencing fragrances or should be even impacting the way you experience fragrances as a whole. That being said, I do feel that this is an interesting enough conversation to be tackled because talking about abstract subjects like this and very subjective topics, I think it's a very good exercise and ultimately it might lead to a little bit more clarity. Before we start, a very quick summary of how FragTalk works. Each episode is broken down into 3 segments, the first of which is basically me talking about some fragrances that have been influential to me, that I've been enjoying wearing, and that I just feel like showcasing to you. It's a fun way to just showcase some of my collection, not necessarily in a review form. It's just a brief way to talk about what I've been enjoying and what I've been wearing lately. The second section is basically dedicated to Q&A. I'll be answering questions that you guys have submitted in the comments in the previous episodes. By the way, if you want to submit a question, tag it in the comment down below with like Q&A or something like that so that I know that it's a question for the Q&A. I will not answer that right away. I'll just put it in the pile and answer it in due time. This is also a section where I might give you a life update and tell you what I've been up to lately. The third section is definitely the meat and potatoes of the episode. Today we're going to be covering niche perfumery, or rather the definition of niche perfumery, and if it even makes sense to be defining niche perfumeries from the designers or even just categorization in general. Another quick thing that I want to say before we start is that these are just my opinion. It's just a very personalized view on the fragrance world. And these episodes are actually more for me than for you, just because they get me thinking and they get me talking out loud about a topic, and they really help me form ideas, and I really enjoy that. In the past especially, teaching was a massive part of my career and I really enjoy the process. Not because I like telling people what they should be doing or not, or like lecturing people. It's more because I like talking about things, and talking to people while trying to explain and decrypt my thoughts is actually my preferred learning method. I learned so much while teaching. I just learned so much about myself. And even in these videos, I mean, sometimes I even say in reviews that I pick up a fragrance and I decide to review it even if I'm not completely ready, because the process of trying to explain something so abstract and subjective really clears the mind and it really gives you a perspective on things. I love putting words to thoughts. We as adults are way too confident in our capabilities to like comprehend things, and we don't stop to think about how to actually explain things. I always encourage adults to have a little bit more of a childish approach to observation. Ask yourself questions, give yourself answers, try to explain things. You'd be surprised how much knowledge you can pull out from that intuitive experience that you have as an adult. All right, enough with the intro. Let's get into the first section. As I said, this is where I showcase some fragrances that I've been enjoying lately. Lately, I've been on some sort of a break from heavier fragrances. There's something about the scent profiles that was a little bit nauseating to me. It might have been that I was physically ill, or that I have been physically ill during January and I'm still sort of recovering. And now I can pretty much confidently say that I'm finally over it and I'm back into the mood for more interesting, exciting fragrances with a little bit of a fun edge to them. The first fragrance that I want to showcase is actually Louis Vuitton's Nouveau Monde. This is a leather fragrance not too dissimilar from something like Ombre Nomade, which I've talked about extensively on this channel. I had that fragrance and I wore it a lot and I really liked that DNA, but ultimately I gave it away because I found Ombre Nomade a little bit too cloying, a little bit too oppressive. It puts this massive obnoxious fragrance aura around you that was ultimately making me a little bit uncomfortable and affecting the way I would wear the fragrance. I couldn't wear it just because it felt too elegant, and this is something again that I covered in my review. By the way, one of the first reviews on my channel, so be kind. But yeah, there's something about that fragrance that really requires a lot of personality. It requires you to have this incredibly bold attitude to justify that massive wear experience. Sometimes I was in the mood for that and my personality really matched that character. But more often than not, I'm a lot more subtle, I'm a lot more introverted, and Ombre Nomade was just a little bit too much. Now, after I traded that fragrance, I was always kind of longing for that DNA. It has a very special smell. Now, I never repurchase fragrances that I let go of because to me, it's just like moving on, and it's just part of the fragrance process. I just move along. But I still kind of wanted to experience that DNA, so ultimately, I got Nouveau Monde because apparently on paper, this was quite similar to Ombre Nomade. And I have to confirm that this is in fact very, very similar to Ombre Nomade as far as vibe goes, as far as DNA goes, but it's much, much, much more subtle. It's much more approachable, and it doesn't have that massive sweet note up top that really contrasts with the leather and makes Ombre Nomade special. This is a lot more linear, it's a lot more predictable. It's a very rugged, rough, dry leather, similar again to Ombre Nomade. It's a very particular DNA that I strongly associate to Louis Vuitton fragrances. There's something in here that Jacques Cavalier uses, maybe a synthetic note that really boosts performance and projection, that has a specific type of smell. It smells intentionally powerful, and I already talked about this also in my first impression comparison where I talked about Mana. This one here is a very enjoyable fragrance to me. I really like wearing it. It has this very saffron heavy leather. It has a little bit of a more dusty component to it compared to Ombre Nomade. It smells a little bit more, not gourmand, but there's a little bit more of a sweet cocoa vanilla thing going on. Really beautiful. I like it. It's a fun wear, and it's actually quite approachable. Now, some people say that it's way more animalic than Ombre Nomade, or it's the most animalic Louis Vuitton. I don't agree whatsoever. There's no funk, there's no barnyardness in here. It's a very beautiful, very elegant thing. I could probably signature set something like this in the winter month, but I'm actually also looking forward to wearing this even in the summer evenings. It has this very mass appealing, likable scent profile that's also quite exotic and rugged. It's really good. I really like Louis Vuitton fragrances. They have this beautiful combination of being exciting while still being likable. Yes, they're expensive, but I do feel that somehow, compared to a lot of other fragrances, they're almost justified. And I'll be referring to Louis Vuitton fragrances, by the way, in the third section of this video. The second fragrance that I want to showcase that also rides that very fun, exciting, enticing, and almost mass appealing leather note is Cupid's Kiss by Electimuss London. This is a fragrance by Julien Rasquinet, by the way. I really like Electimuss London. Everything I try from the house is to my liking. They have this, again, this combination of being very high quality. I do feel that the fragrances smell high quality while still being mass appealing in a way and very, very fun. They have a little bit of a Zerjoff vibe, but I don't know, they feel a little bit more distinguished. I feel that they have a little bit more imagination. I have a full discovery set of 20 fragrances that I'll be sampling on a speed dating episode. Well, probably 2, just because otherwise it would be way too long and way too fatiguing. But yeah, full bottle wise, I have Black Caviar and I have this. This is, again, it's very mass appealing. It has some sweetness to it. It's still kind of rugged, still kind of edgy, but it's likable. It's a very fun scent. I really like it. Julien Rasquinet made a killer scent with this. I also feel that he delivered on the other one that he made for the house, Gladiator Oud. That one there is a little bit more edgy, a little bit more funky. Still, I think, relatively appreciable, really interesting. I like this a lot. This is a fun wear, and it's very much comparable in terms of vibe and in terms of wearability to something like Nouveau Monde by Louis Vuitton. Is that likable? It's exotic but edgy, very, very fun. I would say it leans a little bit masculine. I mean, it's completely unisex, but it has a leathery facet that kind of leans a little bit masculine. I love wearing this. And again, people around me seem to appreciate it. The last fragrance that I want to showcase in this section is another one of those fun, exciting, leathery ones. This one here is Kajal IV. It's easily the more mass appealing from the 3. It's easily the more youthful from the 3. It has a lot of sweetness to it. It has a lot of zing, it has a lot of likability while still retaining some edge from the leather and the tobacco. Everything is really smoothly put together, although this one definitely smells the most synthetic to me. There's a massive synthetic boosting compound in here that kind of reminds me of Oud for Greatness or even Parfums de Marly Altan. It's not one of those empty volume type of things, but it does smell like amber woody in a way. It's not bad. It's, again, very smooth. It's very light, while also being sweet, surprisingly light actually for what it is. It's again, it's a very mass appealing, likable, very youthful, edgy fragrance. I don't know, there's something in here that kind of comes across as boyish to me and not in an offensive way whatsoever. This is a very fun, very likable scent. And I love wearing this. I don't mind that at all. I don't mind feeling a little bit younger. Some scents that I have are very mature leaning. They feel like they age me a little bit. This one here brings me down in age, and it's a really nice feeling. It's a fun scent that I can easily wear without thinking about it too much. Even at the office, no problem. It's a very likable, very unique smelling scent. No one around you is smelling like this. Okay, now that we have that out of the way, let's move on to the second section of this video. And before we tackle Q&A, let me just give you a little bit of a life update. I'm going to be going to Essence 2025 in Milan next week. So if you want me to cover anything about that, I'm not going to film or anything like that, but if you want me to cover it in a specific video talking about Essence and giving you my impressions about Essence, leave a comment down below. I'll be sure to sort of like formulate my thoughts into that pattern. It's going to be an interesting experience for two reasons. One, because I've never been to Essence, so that will be new for me. I've never experienced that sort of expo. Secondly, I'll be going with Marcello from the Niche Fragrance Collector YouTube channel. I'll be joining his tour, and I decided to go with him just because it would be neat to meet him, and it would be neat just to experience Essence with him. I like the guy, I like his content. I already featured his channel on the first episode of FragTalk, and I thought it would be just a good experience to meet the guy and just like hang out. So I might be reporting on that. I might be reporting on just seeing Essence from a more professional point of view, I guess. I don't know. Again, if you have any comments, if you have any suggestions, if you want me to cover Essence and my experience in Essence, leave a comment down below. I'll be happy to do so. Every time I think about fragrance houses being acquired by corporations, the first thing that comes to mind is the case of Frédéric Malle being acquired and he actually leaving the brand. I don't really know what to think about this. I mean, it is sort of inevitable in a way. I think that it's inevitable that a brand that generates interest and traction ultimately gets offers to be acquired by bigger corporations. That's just a process of capitalism. I don't really want to get into that. But as far as fragrances goes, I do feel that it's net negative ultimately, just because a corporation is less interested in the single brand. They have a repertoire of brands under their belt. They're interested in sales and they're interested in profits mainly. So they'll try to cut the cost of production, make fragrances that are mass appealing, and ultimately that leads to just worse products in general for the consumer. I'm not saying that this is the case for all fragrance acquisitions. There might be a standing party within the fragrance house that is dedicated to maintaining the quality of product or not. This is really a case-by-case scenario, and we can't really 100% accurately predict what's going to happen to each brand that gets acquired. But based on the past, based on what the consumer has experienced, just quality in general declines, so that's really not good. On the flip side, although a lot of brands get acquired and get completely demolished, like Creed, a lot of new brands come to life and they surface, taking the front seat. Something like Les Indemodables, it's a brand that really is new. They make excellent fragrances. Yes, they might be acquired one day in the future, we don't know, but we can't really control it. All you can do is just enjoy what is out there, enjoy the current state of things. And even a brand that I love, like Amouage, which is pretty much being acquired by L'Oreal, might be completely demolished. Some say that the brand has been in decline since Christopher Chong left. I'm not necessarily in agreement with that, but again, it's beyond me, it's way bigger than me, and I can't do anything about it. All I can do is enjoy the brand while still think it's enjoyable and just move on when it's not anymore. That's pretty much it. Second question is, what is your opinion on splitting scents according to season? Again, this is a pretty big question, so let me just try to be quick and summarize here. I do not think that scents are season bound or season related. You can wear pretty much everything anytime you want, in any situation you want. When I talk about seasonalities in my reviews, it's mainly as a guiding factor. And I know that everyone has their own preferences and some people just like going against the current, but ultimately we kind of have to agree on communication. And when I say that something is more suited to winter, I mean that it has a scent profile that is a little bit more heavier and a little bit more dense. And the majority of people might find it too heavy and too cloying for summer. Again, there's a million variables out there. For example, summers where I live are incredibly mild. I get a maximum temperature of like 29 to 30 degrees Celsius. That's very cool compared to a lot of places on Earth. So these are just guidelines, mine and everyone else's. This is a very subjective matter. It's kind of like talking about colors. If I say that yellow or orange is warm, because I associate it to fire, you might be, oh no, to me it's very fresh because I associate it to lemons and citruses. Again, it's very, very subjective. The majority of people will consider yellow and orange warm. I just abide to statistical communication rules to best convey a message. Third question, what is your take on molecule fragrances? This is gonna be easy because I straight up don't like molecule fragrances for two reasons. One, because I can barely smell the actual molecule in molecule fragrances. I just can't smell Iso Super or Ambroxan per se. And in the past, I even bought one of those bottles off eBay of Ambroxan because I thought that they could be used to like enhance the performance of a fragrance. And that's complete BS, by the way, because if you have a very weak citrus fragrance, no matter how much Ambroxan you'll spray on, those citrus notes will fade off at the same rate. And what you'll be left with is Ambroxan. So it doesn't really make sense. It's not like Ambroxan is boosting the overall performance of those notes that are very fleeting, you know? And if you like the smell of Ambroxan, by all means, but you're not enhancing the fragrance, you're just smelling that compound. It just so happens that I'm very insensitive to Iso Super or whatever these molecule scents are, and I find them super weak overall. Now, if you happen to smell them, if you like very weak skin scent type of scents, by all means, go ahead with some molecule type fragrances. I like heavier fragrances. I like fragrances that have a lot of body and presence. Those molecule fragrances to me are just a waste of time and just a waste of a wear. And I know it sounds crazy, but right now I'm taking advantage of each wear I have just because I have so many fragrances and so many samples to get through. I just can't be bothered to just wear stuff that I can barely smell. Fourth question is, how do you go about spraying for projection when wearing layers? I seem to remember that this is related to FragTalk episode 1, where I said that I basically mainly wear short sleeve everything. So I spray on my arms for projection and for just smelling the scent because I like spraying on skin. And I think that the extended question was something along the lines of, if you have a sweater, long sleeve, or maybe like even a jacket, how do you spray for projection? Well, it really depends on the fragrance, because if I'm wearing something really dense and heavy, something like Interlude 53, I will not spray it on clothes because number one, it stains clothes. Number two, it's basically eternal and I don't want my garments to smell like Interlude forever. So if I'm wearing more lighter, more office-friendly fragrances, yes, I'll spray them on clothes, specifically on the more outer layer that is easy to wash, like a shirt. I can't just wear a shirt over and over again for 3 weeks. I have to wash it after like 2-3 wears. So in that case, I think it's okay. But unless I'm signature scenting something, which I don't do, I will never spray on outer garments, stuff that gets rarely washed, just because, again, it tends to sit around forever. Ultimately, it's a fairly simple question. It's a very limited type of approach for the answer. You have little skin exposed, so you either take advantage of that and spray on skin, or you just spray on clothes and just deal with that. Final question for today is, how do you budget for fragrance purchases? This is a massive topic of conversation, so I'm just scratching the surface here. I might revisit this whole in section number 3 of FragTalk for another video, maybe down the road, maybe confronting with someone else. And what I do personally is assign a certain amount of money to a certain period of time. It could be a month, it could be quarterly, it could be whatever you want. For the sake of an example, I can say, well, it could be $100 a month, it could be $200 every 3 months, it could be $500 a quarter. It really depends on you and your finances. And once you establish that number, considering other hobbies, expenses, and just generally available income, you never go over that. One exception I have for the rule is if I manage to trade off a fragrance to fund another one, I can do that. That is keeping everything just stable economically. And it has definitely happened in the past that I've sold a number of fragrances to fund another one. Sometimes I traded like 2 or more fragrances just for one. Another time I trade 1 fragrance and I got like 3 back. It really depends on the values of the fragrances. As long as you don't go over the monthly or periodic budget that you have set, you're fine. And this is not taking into account other factors such as maybe you want to limit your collection to a certain number of bottles. Maybe you don't have space for that, but that's a whole other topic. We're talking about budget. Budget-wise, it's pretty straightforward. You just set an amount that is sustainable and reasonable and you do not go over it. If you go over it once, it's a slippery slope and you will go over it again. And you don't want to do that. So if something is exceeding your budget, you either sell something, trade something off, or you just save up. Just wait more periods so you have a little bit more spending and then you purchase what you want. It's that simple. All right, time to tackle the main topic of conversation for today's episode. What are niche fragrances? Obviously, if you're watching this video, I'm assuming that you're into fragrances. And if you're into fragrances and you're watching this video, I'm assuming that you also watched a lot of other videos on YouTube. And if you've watched other videos on YouTube, I'm sure you came across the terminology niche and designer fragrances. Now, the general consensus is that the difference between niche and designer revolves around the intentionality of the house. If a brand designs or produces products other than fragrances, that is basically considered a designer house, a designer brand. Instead, if a brand only produces fragrances, that's considered a niche brand. Now, I don't know who established this rule, I don't know who established this definition, but it's basically what everyone is abiding to. So we have to take that into account. And not because it's true or false, it's just because, as I was saying before, it's the general consensus, so it's the basis to establish communication. And even I, although I do not agree with that definition, I still use it because it's the easiest way to convey a message and it's the easiest way to communicate to the general public. Unfortunately, the reality is that this definition isn't even fully respected and it's bended to everyone's preferences. People think that something like Guerlain is a niche house when actually Guerlain produces a lot of cosmetics, a lot of other products. So they're not necessarily a niche house by that definition. Another example of this is the House of Fragonard from Grasse. People refer to this as a niche fragrance brand when in effect they produce a lot of stuff, from plates to mugs to scarves to blankets to a lot of other stuff. So in effect, they are a designer house. You could potentially say that designer fragrances are from those brands that actually have a more mass appealing, established, closed brand. Something like Armani, something like Dolce & Gabbana, something like Chanel. These are all very established, closed brands first and foremost, and fragrances are kind of like their side gig. But again, this is kind of flexing the rules to everyone's preference and perception. Ultimately, I don't really think that it's that important to define something with this precision, because I do feel that the general idea that people have is fairly clear. When you think of Nasomatto, you're clearly thinking niche, and when you think of something like Dior, you clearly think designer. That's all fine, but the reality is that there are a lot of nuances there. For example, is the Dior private line still designer? You could say, well, yeah, because it's made by Dior. I would say that it kind of blurs the line because it's designed for a little bit more of a specialized audience. And on the niche side, you could easily ask the question, is Parfums de Marly in the same category of niche as something like Toscovat? And I feel that everyone who knows these two brands can resoundingly answer no. And these nuances are where people get confused and they start blurring the lines of definition. Is this ultimately important for fragrance enjoyment and for fragrance experience? Absolutely not. This is just an exercise in conversation to prompt us to really be a little bit more thoughtful and to allow us to properly characterize things according to our defined parameters. And in a similar way to how I talked about a fragrance being somewhere on the scale between utility and artistry in FragTalk episode 2, here also we have to establish a scale that is a little bit more graduated. It's not just black and white. It's not just niche or designer. Everything has to be evaluated according to the actual dictionary definition of niche. And the dictionary definition of niche is a specialized segment of the market for a particular kind of product or service, which basically means that the more niche something is, the more it's going to be tailored to a very specific contained audience. And the more mass market something is, the more it's going to be tailored to a more broader audience. And in all effects, for this exercise, our scale will have on one side mass market appeal, and on the other side will have a very niche market appeal. And all fragrances will lie somewhere in between these two extremes, somewhere along the scale. Now that we established this mass appealing in this scale, it's actually quite easy to place fragrances on this range and to locate their target audience. For example, if we take something like Dior Sauvage, we can easily push it all the way down the mass appealing part of the scale because it's a product that is designed to be liked. It's designed to be mass appealing, and it's sold a ton of numbers. So it is indeed liked. And if we take something like a Toscovat fragrance, we can easily push it all the way down the niche part of the scale because that appeals to a very, very restricted audience that is interested in very, very specific fragrances. And you can see that with this concept, it's actually easy to place brands on the scale. Even if we take a brand like Creed, which is considered mainstream niche, it's actually relatively easy to locate that it's going to be probably in the first third of the scale, leaning towards the more mass appealing, just because of how popular it is and how likable it is. If you take a fragrance like Aventus, everyone knows what Aventus is, everyone knows what Aventus smells like. It's just incredibly mainstream and very, very likable. And this is absolutely not saying that Aventus is bad because it's more mainstream and that mainstream fragrances are bad or worse compared to more niche options. As much as I'm a niche head, I recognize the value and the quality of good fragrances, and you can find good fragrances along the whole range of the scale. We're just here to spitball about what is niche and what is mainstream. It has nothing to do with quality. I actually think that quality-wise, something like Toscovat is far inferior to something like Dior, because Dior has access to very high quality materials. I'm not saying that they're using them, but they have access to that. They have access to to basically everything. While Toscot is just a guy in his basement making fragrances that are, yes, evocative and artistic, but who knows what's in them. It's kind of like Nasomatto. Alessandro Gualtieri is, yes, focused on quality, and he uses quality synthetics, but he's not there to source the highest quality natural ingredients out there. He's not an ingredient nerd. And here we come to our subdivisions of categories. And I really want to underline once again that this is just an exercise in communication. These made up categories are just what I use for like sorting through fragrances and just understanding what something is. Another interesting thing that I want to point out is that the term designer really never came into play when defining this range. A designer brand, or rather a brand that has maybe clothing, can be anywhere along this range. If you take a brand like Comme des Garçons, they make fairly niche, fairly intentional, fairly restricted type of fragrances that definitely lie more on the niche side of things rather than the mass appealing side of things. They make very incensey, very strange, very dense fragrances that are not mass appealing at all. They're almost considered niche, and people refer to them almost as niche, despite being clearly a designer brand that makes clothes. And another example of that is something like, again, Parfum de Marly. They make very mass appealing fragrances that are designed to be as mass appealing as possible, as likable as possible. And despite them being a brand that only focuses on fragrances, they lie all the way onto the mainstream end of things. And once you start placing various brands on the scale, you start to understand what kind of fragrances you like, and you can easily identify which group or category of fragrances you're more interested in. Going back to the categories, given the fact that we established that the mass appealing factor is all the way at one end of the scale, we can basically say that more mainstream fragrances lie to that side. And this includes mainstream niche fragrances like, again, Parfums de Marly, like Creed, like Initio, like a lot of new fragrance brands that are very mass appealing. I would put in there something like Argos, something like Mind Games. These are all brands that are designed to be liked. They're designed to be mass appealing. And despite they have some edginess and some character, they're all, again, likable. They're all very easy on the nose. They're all more considered like entry-level niche brands. An entry-level niche is, again, from a point of view, from the point of view of someone who is experienced and who likes niche fragrances, which are on the other end of the scale. So if I place myself at one end of the scale, in this case on the niche side, because I'm a niche snob and I'm looking towards the mass appealing side, I see people moving towards me. So I think of brands like Parfums de Marly or Creed like entry-level niche, because I'm at the niche side and that's my point of view. But if I put myself at the mass appealing end of the scale and I look towards niche, I might think that those fragrances are super stinky and super weird and unwearable, and I'm thinking that actually things coming my way are more likable and more easy to wear. So everything is about perspective, preferences, and point of view. Other categories of fragrances can also be placed in the scale without necessarily occupying a very specific part of the scale. For example, if we talk about artisanal perfume, it's not necessarily something that is either mainstream or niche. Yes, you might say that it tends towards niche just because artisanal perfumes use very complex ingredients, very articulate ingredients. They often focus on very stinky ingredients like animalic notes, like oud notes, etc. And they might fall towards the niche end of the scale, but that's not necessarily always the case. Even if you take a very artisanal brand, basically the most artisanal brand out there, something like Arige Ladurée, which is famous for using very natural, stinky animalics, very natural, exclusive oud notes, and just very stinky fragrances in general. Something like Arige Ladurée actually occupies a far broader range than you think, because yes, they do offer weird, stinky fragrances like the oud ones, but they also offer very beautiful, very mass appealing, very curated florals, for example, that might be a lot more likable, and a lot leaning more towards the more mainstream part of things. They're not mainstream per se because they're also very exclusive, very expensive, and very hard to get, but they can be mainstream appealing. This, by the way, this whole scale is not even taking into account price, because price is a very limiting factor on its own. Price should actually have a scale on its own to be overlaid to this, because if you take something that is incredibly mass appealing but is also very, very expensive, it will inevitably move towards a more niche market of things, because if you think about it, it will be tailored to a much more restricted audience, an audience that can afford it. So again, everything is very, very subjective. Everything is very, very abstract. And this is very much an exercise in conversation. So I mentioned mainstream niche. I mentioned artisanal perfumery like Arige Ladurée and Bortnikov. There's also artistic perfumery, and Tosqua definitely falls into that category. But within the artistic spectrum, we also have stuff like Melfushuni, who makes fragrances which are, yes, artistic, very evocative, very abstract, but they're also designed to be somewhat likable. So for example, if you take something like Sogni or Violinere, these two fragrances are very beautiful, they're very evocative, abstract, very romantic and melancholic, but they also smell good. They don't smell off-putting whatsoever. So I wouldn't necessarily put them all the way down to the niche side of things. Sometimes categorizing things is very, very difficult because in effect, there's like an infinite number of skills, there's an infinite number of ways to categorize things. So we just have to choose what works for us, and we have to just choose one fixed skill and just place things along those skills. Then we can compare skills if necessary. And just to make a point, the last skill I've used in the second episode of FragTalk, where we compared utility towards artistry, can be basically overlaid to this mass appealing to niche fragrance skill. And it's not necessarily one-to-one, they're not necessarily completely overlaid, but they're very, very similar in approach and idea. And this is probably due to the fact that I'm the one that came up with both skills, and I have a very specific way of looking at things, and I just tend to box things and categorize things according to a specific plan. Just to close this off, I want to quickly go back to the price thing because I do think that it's relevant, and I really want to pose a question. Do niche fragrances need to be expensive? Is niche related to expensive? I would say ultimately not. Now, niche fragrances tend to be expensive for various reasons. Sometimes it's because of quality of materials. Some other times, and I would say most of the times, well, maybe not in fragrances, price is very much tied to volume of production and volume of sales. So when a very niche brand is tailoring to a very niche audience and everything else being equal, meaning the quality of materials and the actual cost of the juice, the price will go up, even just for, again, the raw materials or even just for the packaging. Bottles cost less the more you order. So price is inevitably somehow tied to this scale of mass appealingness towards niche. But at the same time, we have fragrances which are very, very mass appealing, very much produced on the mass scale, like the Louis Vuitton fragrances, which are also very expensive. And here what comes into play is actually the concept of luxury. Luxury is a very difficult concept to talk about. I'll be probably tackling this topic on a whole other section alone, just because it's so broad and so subjective and so controversial. Luxury, the idea of luxury and the brand image have a massive weight on the price of the product. And again, taking into account Louis Vuitton fragrances, they're probably relatively cheap to produce. The bottles themselves are simple, they're not too articulated. Yes, they have a magnetic cap, but ultimately they're super, super basic. And it's all about the design, it's all about the brand, it's all about the brand image. So you're paying for that. And a lot of people, probably coming from the point of view of the artisanal world, are criticizing these brands for the lack of quality for price. And I totally get it. With a brand like Arige Ladurée, yes, they're very expensive, but you're arguably getting super high quality materials, which somehow justify the cost in our brain, in our mind. And it's just not the same, or it might not feel the same when you know that there's a massive corporation eating up these massive margins of profit over some fragrances that are easily mass produced. But again, this is a huge topic of conversation. Luxury is difficult to talk about. The concept of luxury has different value for everyone. Some people might find the idea of owning a Louis Vuitton very, very gratifying, as some people find the idea of owning a Rolex very gratifying. And I'm not there to knock on that. I can't knock on that. And that's why a brand like Roja sells. It's a brand that is strongly associated with luxury and exclusivity, and people like that. They're willing to pay for that feeling. And on this note, I just want to close off by saying that it's all about subjective association of value. Something like the high quality of ingredients of Arige Ladurée might be meaningless to someone who cares about the brand image. And they're not wrong, they're not making a bad choice just because they're not valuing the same thing as you. Everyone has different values, and I fully respect that. That's why I like this concept, this language so much, because perfumery, it's so open to debate, it's so open to interpretation. There's always something to learn right around the corner. If you like this type of concept, if you like my approach to video, feel free to subscribe. It's always massively appreciated and helps the channel. If you want to interact with me, like comment, suggestion, opinion, or anything else down below, I always reply and I always keep the conversation open. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for your time. It's never taken for granted. Many more videos to come, many more fragrance talks to come. See you in the next one, and cheers.